I've come here to Berlin to see the Neues Museum and to discover their vast ancient Egyptian collection. Won't you come with me?
From the famous Nefertiti to Queen Tiye, this museum in the center of Europe contains 5,000 years worth of treasures from the pharaohs. From tyrannical rulers to religious zealots and everything in between, the glory of ancient Egypt is here for all to see. However, many would say that these treasures are ill-gotten gains and spoils of war. It wasn't too long ago that these artifacts faced near annihilation.
You can see here, I have an image of this exact room when it was bombed in World War II. This is incredible.
In 1945, Hitler's Nazi troops attacked Berlin. The museum staff hurriedly prepared for the worst and relocated many of their masterpieces. The museum was bombed and hundreds of ancient art pieces were destroyed. Irreplaceable, they were lost for forever. The Nazis stormed the museum and destroyed what was left over by hand. Weeks later, brave civilians arrived on the scene and volunteered their time to clean up this precious museum. This haunting image shows men rescuing a bust of Tutankhamun from the rubble. A sanctuary for art became the worst place on earth. Yet many things have changed, and today Berlin stands high after its fall. Today, the museum's island is a gem of Europe.
And this courtyard here, with the sun coming through, to feel a little bit more connected to nature. This courtyard was painted in the 1800s, but blown up during World War II. And there's something quite beautiful and very sad about this room. It's almost a monument to the war, to all the wars of ancient Egypt, of Germany, of the world, because they've left this room untouched. Where the paint has chipped off, they've left it. There's still bullet marks in some of the pieces, the Egyptian pieces. It's very, very touching to see.
This museum focuses on the ancient, with decoration only to enhance the artifacts.
Here at the Neues Museum in Berlin, what is so beautiful is the ceiling. It looks original, but that's because it's so damaged. These frescoes were made in the 1800s, painstakingly made to look original. And then, when this museum was bombed in World War II, they decided when they renovated the museum to not fix it. So that's why we have these ceilings.
Copied from tombs and temples, this ceiling is filled with astrological signs followed by the ancient Egyptians. The sun, the moon, and the stars played a big part for the Egyptians, and each temple had a chief astronomer. And each pharaoh valued their astronomer, dating all the way back to the time of the pyramids, over 4,500 years ago. Astronomy allowed for the alignment of the pyramids, and dotted around the pharaohs' tombs were hundreds of tombs for their nobles. "4,500 years later, some of these tombs can now be marveled at in Berlin. This tomb belonged to two men, one the mayor of Memphis, and the other the overseer of the mortuary temple of the pharaoh.
Mehen and Nefertiti, they were nobles that lived during the time of Pharaoh Khufu during the 4th dynasty while the Great Pyramid was being built. Here we see Nefertiti holding the staff to show that he's a nobleman in full color. And as we go down, we see Nefertiti with his hand up, showing that he can write. He's about to start writing something on a wall. And up here is his boss's name, Khufu, the owner of the Great Pyramid. And this entire mastaba was taken from Giza and brought here to Berlin.
Khufu had many of his loyal followers buried close by around his pyramid.
This is Merib, the commander of the troops during Pharaoh Khufu's reign. We see Merib here as he's entering his tomb, his name written here, Merib, with the heart scarab as his name ending with the B. And here we can see Khufu's cartouche, Ka-U-Fu. It's just incredible to think that this is from the time of the Great Pyramid. That's around 4,300 years old. It is absolutely mind-blowing.
In the doorway we see a family scene of Merib, his son, daughter, and his wife welcoming the body into the tomb.
And here is Merib, the commander of the troops for Pharaoh Khufu, and his beautiful wife, dressed in the traditional 4th dynasty dress with the breasts exposed and a high-waisted skirt. I wonder how they brought this all the way from Giza to Berlin.
The 4th dynasty was one of the highest points. However, after the death of Khufu, many family quarrels would cause many issues, including the end of a dynasty. The 5th dynasty consisted of 9 pharaohs ruling for over 150 years. These pharaohs continued the tradition of building pyramids for their afterlife. Egypt was not much of a desert land as it is today. 4,500 years ago, it was more of a savanna landscape filled with antelope and wild animals. Still, the everyday people lived along the strip of fertile soil along the Nile. For the beginning of the 5th dynasty, the land was prosperous, yet after a while it began to decline. This scribe, named Henka, lived during the 5th dynasty, but was the high priest and the overseer of the pyramids of Snefru from the 4th dynasty. People who were close to the pharaoh were greatly rewarded during this period. Shown with his wife and child, this nobleman from the 5th dynasty, from the reign of the first pharaoh of this dynasty, Userkaf, would have witnessed a dramatic change in politics from the 4th dynasty to the 5th dynasty. The succeeding pharaoh raised the 5th dynasty to its high point. He increased Egypt's trade and military presence. Pharaoh Sahura, the king that would lead expeditions into Punt, Assyria, Byblos, and Libya, deified in his pyramid at Abu Sir.
Taken from the pyramid temple for King Sahura, this amazing scene shows very interesting gods that we don't usually see depicted in this kind of form. We have the god Geb, the god of the earth, and he's shown here with a full beard and the two feathers of Amun. And before Geb, we have this rather strange-looking creature. He is the god of chaos and disorder and destruction. His name is Set. And above, we can see that these two gods are helping Pharaoh Sahura in the 5th dynasty to capture his enemies. But what's interesting is there are enemies that are Egyptian as well. You can see very clearly Egyptian, and a man from Libya shown with a uraeus on his forehead. These are all very close countries, and there would have been a cross connection of cultures throughout many millennia. So it is very possible that these might not be Egyptian enemies, they might be foreign enemies imitating the Egyptians.
After Sahura's rule, we see the country suffering from an immense drought. The Egyptian way of life was under threat, with increasing pressure from neighboring countries. The penultimate ruler of the 5th dynasty, Djed-Ka-Ra, his skeleton was found inside his pyramid. He reformed Egypt's political standing and mentioned for the first time Nubia, which he conquered to the south. His success followed over into the new set of rulers, the 6th dynasty.
A scene from a 6th dynasty tomb wall. They've brought the entire mastaba again here to Berlin. But what is so interesting is here we see the initial outlines. This is an unfinished tomb. These are the artist's impressions to show the sculptors how to come and chisel out these elaborate embossed carvings. It's just beautiful. So it's as if someone was chipping away, the dead person was brought in, and they went, okay, we're done.
During the 6th dynasty, the leaving of food and goods offerings became more important. For those like this nobleman who could afford it, they could have real offerings placed in the tomb, but as a backup, many times on the walls they had offerings carved for eternity. A false door was often placed inside a separate room in the tomb, which allowed for the family of the deceased to come in and leave offerings, and the spirit of the deceased to come in and out to receive them. Nearing the end of this dynasty, a king who lived into his 90s, named Pepi II, rose to power. But his age and length of rule would bring about many problems within the kingdom.
This is a beautiful vase painted with the famous Egyptian blue from the time of King Pepi II, Ka-Nefertiti, his name is on here. But what I'm very interested in is this strange-looking wooden piece. It's been eaten by termites and very badly damaged, but it would have been a massive representation of a falcon covered in these beautiful blue faience tiles decorated to look like feathers.
Because of the extended age of dear old Pepi II, many regional rulers took it upon themselves to take power, meaning the rise of non-monarchs or nomarchs. Of course, when the country's economy went down, so did its belief in funerary offerings. Instead of having elaborately carved tomb walls or expensive offerings placed in the tomb, These statues would be there almost to provide the service for eternal life of bringing in your offerings. The country was divided within several ruling regions. Up and down the land, each man thinking he was more powerful than the next. A ruler named Ankh-Tifi helped secure Thebes. Following him, a man named Montuhotep came along and reunited Upper and Lower Egypt, starting the Middle Kingdom.
A typical 12th dynasty scene of a woman wearing the typical 12th dynasty dress with the breasts exposed, carrying offerings on top of her head. They might not actually be offerings, they might be scenes from everyday life. Egyptian women putting bread or vegetables from the market and taking it home.
The tradition of offering statues continued all the way into the Middle Kingdom. The Middle Kingdom is one of the most interesting times in ancient Egypt's history. It gives us some of the most gorgeous examples of funerary practices, like this painted wooden coffin with the goddess Isis with her wings stretched out. What's sad is, this is a coffin for a child. Rulers may have changed, but mortality had not.
And yet again, more of a tomb from the Old Kingdom, here in Berlin, with his false wall, well, his false door, with the deceased person coming out to greet the offerings arriving from his family.
The ancients were not oblivious to the fact that also the family would be deceased at some point in the future. Therefore, they had many of the family members depicted in their tomb. This was a practice going all the way back to the Old Kingdom, almost like the mysterious reserve heads, which were probably a backup for the deceased in case their body was lost. On this offering table, known as a hetep, we see them bringing in the sacred oils. The Middle Kingdom was an interesting time, and modern scholars actually refer to this period as the classical period of ancient Egypt, due to the fact of many personal narrative papyri that were found. You see, the parallels between the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom are quite slight. Priests like Ankaf from the 6th dynasty in the Old Kingdom would write down their personal stories, holding a staff with his full figure showing his prosperity. In the Cairo Museum, we have an excellent example of a mayor and priest with a full body holding a staff from the 4th dynasty known as Ka-Apeh.
The connection between Lord Carnarvon and Howard Carter is spread throughout all Egyptian museums. The impact is so strong. These pieces were found by Howard Carter and donated to this museum, pretty similar to the museum in Florence and all over the world, where we find pieces discovered by Howard Carter and Lord Carnarvon.
It is often the smaller pieces that can tell us more about real life than the grand monuments, like this 12th dynasty Cobra Uraeus. Jewelry in the 12th dynasty is some of the most beautiful and delicately executed of all history.
What I'm looking at here is some jewelry from the 12th dynasty around the time of Queen Sobek-Neferu and Sesostris III. And over there is a little shell, and that shell we can see often during the 12th dynasty.
The 12th dynasty saw large amounts of gold flooding into Egypt since the pharaohs invaded Nubia and started more trade routes to the south. Furniture in the Middle Kingdom is some of my favorites, including these cosmetic boxes with ebony and ivory flower handles. Cosmetics have always played a large part in Egyptian history, and they come in a variety of shapes, sizes, and forms, just like today. And accessories were not just for men or for women. Eyeliner was worn by everybody, as was jewelry. This Middle Kingdom pectoral necklace, worn in everyday life, was then placed on the mummy with the scarab in the center representing their heart. This time in history provided us with so much drama, fantastic pharaohs, and tyrannical rulers. This pharaoh was a co-regent with his father and ruled the country for over 45 years.
Amenemhat III, the father of Sobek Neferu, the father of the first ever recorded female pharaoh. And he's so beautiful. He's done in this 12th dynasty style. And you can see he's got those frown lines, pretty similar to Sesostris III.
Amenemhat III saw the Middle Kingdom reach its zenith. Unlike his father, he ruled Egypt relatively peacefully. He had 2 pyramids constructed for himself. In one pyramid, himself, his daughter Sobek Neferu, and the 13th dynasty pharaoh Horewibra were interred. How did his reign of peace come about? Amenemhat I, the son of Sesostris I, a king who would have a long line of prosperous successors. Sesostris I pushed Egypt's borders to the north and the south, invading Nubia twice and Canaan on occasion. It's from Sesostris I that we get the tale of Sinuhe. The scribe wrote that Sesostris had to be brought back to Egypt during an invasion in Libya after his father Amenemhat I had been assassinated. Strong militaristic rulers would follow, such as Amenemhat II and Sesostris II, leading up to the grand ruler of the 12th dynasty, Sesostris III. This ruthless warrior is often shown with a displeased look on his face. Probably considered the most powerful pharaoh of the 12th dynasty, Sesostris III expanded Egypt's borders and kept the enemies at bay by building forts up and down the land. A tale by the Greek Herodotus lists Sesostris as the pharaoh that conquered all the way up to Romania, setting the boundaries and leading the way for Amenemhat III.
This statue has been changed many times over its lifetime, probably created first by Sesostris, then adapted to Amenemhat III. And even on the side, we have the names of Ramses II and his son, the 13th son, Merenptah.
This dynasty is probably considered the classical period, since we get to hear the voices of the everyday people. The 12th dynasty saw a rise in power for nobles and people that served the pharaoh. It was not uncommon for noble families during the 12th dynasty to have butlers, as many similar butler statues have been found. He asks for offering of bread, beer, and fowl on the side of his statue. Sobeknihotep is his name.
This is the High Steward during the 12th dynasty in the reign of Sesostris III. And he's shown in this full cloak As we know, it can get pretty cold in the desert at night.
Apart from having a practical use, these cloaks often served ritual purposes and were worn on special occasions, like Sesostris wearing his cloak at his jubilee. Yet the long success of the 12th dynasty came crashing down. The men and women of ancient Egypt, who were going about their lives as anyone would today, were now faced with the second intermediate period. A female pharaoh known as Sobek Neferu was the last pharaoh of the 12th dynasty. Having no heirs upon her death, there became a power struggle. The 13th dynasty was formed, creating a list of short-lived rulers. Seeing the lack of power in Egypt, the Hyksos from the north invaded and separated the country again. On his knees, holding out 2 offering jars, is Pharaoh Sobek Hotep, one of over 30 pharaohs during the 13th dynasty. The country was divided and rulers changed frequently for almost 200 years.
These are some of the original frescoes from the 1800s, and they've designed these pillars to look like you're inside an Egyptian tomb. And what's amazing, you have the red desert, the sand, and then the black silt of the Nile. And usually a figure would be shown on top of here. And it's beautiful because it sort of looks very authentic.
A pharaoh named Ahmose I defeated the Hyksos and reunited Egypt, forming the 18th dynasty. His son, Amenhotep I, became the second pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, and he expanded Egypt's borders beyond Nubia into Kush and maintained the policies with Libya.
Beautiful scene of Pharaoh Amenhotep I. This is one of the only times we see the Egyptians mixing colors to get some sort of skin pigmentation, rather than the plain red and yellow that is always depicted. He's shown with a beautiful pleated shirt.
Amenhotep I developed the religion and gave us the current version of the Book of the Dead, which would have been used for millennia after his death. He is seen here in such fine dress, as the people saw him as a hero, as a god, as he was the son of the man that liberated Egypt from the foreigners.
But over here is his mother, Ahmose Nefertari.
For a short time, she ruled as co-regent with her son.
Now, she's shown with completely black skin. And this has caused a lot of controversy recently. A lot of Egyptologists think that this skin color means that she is Nubian, but a lot of Egyptologists say it's representation that she has been deified, that she has been mummified. She's become one with Osiris, who's also sometimes shown with black skin to show rebirth. But she's absolutely beautiful, not to be confused with Nefertari Meret Mut, the wife of Ramses II.
Ahmose Nefertari and her son, Amenhotep I, founded the village of Deir el-Medina, and because she was the wife of the man that liberated Egypt and the mother of the next pharaoh, she was deified, and therefore her son was deified as well. The worship of these two royals spread for hundreds of years, and even Ramses II is credited with many stela dedicated to Amenhotep I.
These two royals were worshipped at Deir el-Medina.
They founded a village hidden away from the public, where the workmen who built the tombs in the Valley of the Kings would live with their families, and 3 times a year a special festival was held to honor them. For hundreds of years, this exclusive festival took place in Deir el-Medina, hosted by the families that lived there. A votive statue of Amenhotep I would be carried around the village from door to door, and people who wanted answers to their questions would jump in front of the statue and ask, and the priests would be compelled to lean to a left, right, forward or back, giving the specific answer. This strong woman laid the path for many women in the country to follow. And just a few short years after Ahmose Nefertari, a woman became pharaoh. A kneeling statue of Queen Hatshepsut,
showing her piety by giving an offering of beer or wine to the gods.
She became pharaoh because her father was a pharaoh and the male heir was too young.
There's a lot of speculation about Senenmut and his relationship with Hatshepsut. It's so interesting that we see statues of Senenmut shown as a scribal statue. And he has baby Neferure, the daughter of Hatshepsut. We don't know who the father of Neferure is, but he's shown very close with her.
It is unclear whether Neferure was the daughter of Senenmut or the daughter of Hatshepsut's previous pharaoh husband. Yet it is interesting that Senenmut mentions Neferure in his tomb. Neferure took on the roles of Lady of the Two Lands and the god's wife when her mother Hatshepsut became pharaoh. Hatshepsut had an exceptionally successful reign. She is famous for leading many expeditions into the land of Punt, where she brought back many botanical treasures. Later in her reign, when he was older, the man that was born to be the next pharaoh became the head of Hatshepsut's army. Thutmose III finally took the throne when Queen Hatshepsut died. In his time, Thutmose III expanded Egypt's empire to the largest it had ever seen. Having many years to train in the army while his stepmother ruled the country, Thutmose III became one of Egypt's most fearsome fighters.
I've just seen something I've been waiting so long to see. She's here. Queen Tiye, the wife of Amenhotep III. I'm taking her home with me. You know, my friend Diane, she's always asked me this question. If you go to a museum, have a look around and think, if this museum was on fire, what piece would I want to save? I know a lot of you might think Nefertiti in this museum, but for me, it's Queen Tiye.
This wooden bust of Queen Tiye was discovered at Malkata, the palace built for her on the western bank near Luxor. She is actually wearing a crown on this bust, not an afro as many have suggested, as is indicated by the blue lapis beads which would have encrusted the crown. She wears a gold band on her brow and a hole for a cobra and a vulture. Atop her head she wears the feathers, horns and sun disk, indicating the goddess Mut. The eyes would have been lined with thick black paint, and she wears one earring with two cobras. Some suggest that Queen Tiye ruled as a co-regent in the early years of her husband Pharaoh's reign. Amenhotep III was an entirely peaceful pharaoh. He was the grandfather of Tutankhamun. This unknown bust is of the most famous pharaoh of them all, King Tut, the son of the heretic king Akhenaten. Incredibly beautiful woman.
From the late 18th Dynasty. Her name is Maya, and she was the nurse for Tutankhamun. And she's shown here with her husband, with their cones of perfume on their head, and at the bottom here, holding her husband around the chest with elegant little fingers, showing that she loves her husband, who you can see has the traditional Aman in little belly to show that they lived well. And underneath, her cute little pet monkey. It's just incredible to think that this is how people lived. I know these are images to be shown to the gods. It might not be the everyday life, but certainly once a year they would have done something where they dressed up like this.
The rich nobles during the late 18th Dynasty in the reign of Tutankhamun were treated like kings, but nowhere near on the scale as the next 19th Dynasty, the Ramessides. This museum is filled with treasures from the entire history of Egypt, yet one pharaoh remains elusive here, Ramses II, the pharaoh that had more statues and monuments made than any other.
Khaim was it, the son, one of the sons of Ramses II. He became high priest of Ptah in Memphis, and there are rumors that he lived below ground in the Serapeum at Saqqara. But what I love about this statue of him, he's shown with the side lock of youth. And this would be cut off when you became a man, when you turned around age 13. But yet he's still shown here in a very Ramesside style as an adult, as a high priest.
Family became of the utmost importance during Ramses II's reign. As the statue suggests, we see a man and his 2 wives with their 3 children presented before them. Generally, monogamy was practiced in ancient Egypt, apart from the pharaoh who was allowed many wives. But in this case, and in a few special cases, we see men with 2 wives. However, the woman remained in charge of the family. This is a mask of the Greek king Agamemnon, and many years ago, people confused Agamemnon to be a king of Egypt, and that is how the 2 colossal statues of Amenhotep III became named the Colossi of Memnon, after this Greek king. Egypt was a possible jewel in the crown for all neighboring countries. It was invaded by the Assyrians. The Nubians chased the Assyrians out, as we see 2 Nubian men here depicted as Egyptians. However, the Assyrians chased the Nubians back out, and then the native Egyptians took back control, forming the 26th Dynasty.
This is a beautiful green stone head of Pharaoh Amasis II, because he was named Amasis probably about 1,000 years after the first pharaoh, Amasis.
Amasis being the Greek version of his name. In ancient Egyptian, his name is Ahmose. However, Amasis is a bit less confusing. Amasis was able to foil the invasion of Egypt from the Babylonians, and Egypt, having good ties with Greece, was even increased during his reign, as he contributed 1,000 talents of gold to rebuild the Temple of Delphi in Greece. With exquisite detail, this masterpiece of Egyptian art of an unknown man is simply called the Green Head of Berlin. We may not know who he is, but we do know that he lived around the time when Egypt was then ruled by the Greeks who had chased the Persians out of Egypt, known as the Ptolemies. In 332 BC, Alexander the Great liberated Egypt from the Persians and was named Pharaoh. His successors went on to rule Egypt with a mix of Greek and Egyptian culture, the most famous being the final pharaoh of Egypt before she was defeated by the Romans. Resembling images of her coins, this bust is said to be that of the great Cleopatra VII. Shortly after the death of Cleopatra, during the Roman rule, settlements out in the oases of Egypt continued their mummification practices. This set of mummies is an example of a rich family who would export wine to the Mediterranean. Wine was a lucrative business, and this allowed for the family to have their death masks made of gold, like the Golden Father shown with his full beard. The people living in Egypt at this time had a mix of Egyptian, Greek, and Roman funerary customs, exemplified in these lifelike clay death masks made to resemble the deceased.
Not often do we actually get examples of Egyptians using different colored eyeliners and eye makeup. Usually it's just black, but here we can see the green pigment. And what's so amazing, this is a woman from the Roman period, and she's shown wearing bracelets of two serpents in a similar style to what we find generally at Pompeii. And on her death mask, her hair has actually been glued into place so that she could be connected to the goddess Hathor to get into the afterlife, because one of the wishes for the ancient Egyptians to get into the afterlife was to be connected with Hathor. And if you were connected with the goddess of beauty and motherhood, well, she would put in a good word for you with Anubis and Osiris and get you fast-tracked, because you are beautiful enough to be with the gods.
The goddess Hathor was one of the most important deities since the beginning of Egyptian history. On this box from the 19th Dynasty, 3,300 years ago, we see a goddess in the tree giving the water of life to a deceased woman and her spirit. Often, the tree goddess was associated with Hathor. In this time, Hathor was often shown as a cow on the hill of Deir el-Medina. In the 19th Dynasty, Hathor was referred to as the Lady of the West being the realm of the dead. The father of Ramses II, Egypt's greatest pharaoh, is shown here before Osiris, the god of the afterlife. It was up to Osiris to make the final judgment on whether the deceased could enter heaven. Luckily for a pharaoh, once he had died, he became one with Osiris and was often depicted as the god of the afterlife himself. The art style in this pharaoh's reign, Seti I, in my opinion, was the greatest in all of Egypt's history. This pillar was taken from the tomb of Seti I in the 1800s by Giovanni Belzoni, but was never intended for our eyes. During the 19th Dynasty, especially at Deir el-Medina, we have funerary chapels which were intended to be entered by the deceased's family to come and pay tribute to their ancestors. The divine family, Isis and Osiris, meeting with their son Horus in the chapel. On the main wall of the chapel, we see the wife of the deceased kneeling before him, and a high priest, his son, giving him an offering. The deceased needed to be pious towards Osiris, and here we see the man and his wife kneeling before the god. The god Atu makes a special appearance here as one of the ultimate creator gods. Against a small effigy of the goddess Ma'at of truth and justice, your heart is weighed for its sins by Anubis. Many think that the Egyptians were obsessed with death, but they were obsessed with life and wanting to continue a good life in the next world. But at times it came under threat.
Around the 27th dynasty, a lot of different mummification practices were being melded and brought back, discarded. It kept evolving. And here we have such an interesting coffin. We see it was originally painted, but it has been splashed with this black resin, perfumed resin. And this was seemed to have some sort of rejuvenation powers. It's really quite interesting that they would have gone to all the trouble to paint it and then splash it with this black resin.
Rather than canopic jars, these canopic coffins, gilded in gold, contain the mummified organs of the deceased, covered in the sacred black resin. This resin had various ingredients from frankincense and myrrh to the Egyptian blue lotus. Found in many tombs, the sacred blue lotus to the Egyptians had many properties, but the main symbol for it was rebirth. 1,000 years after Pharaoh Pepi II, 3,000 years to us, the glory of the afterlife was under threat.
Something very interesting during the Third Intermediate Period, when people couldn't afford to have elaborate tombs and burials made, and even to have their own Book of the Dead made out of papyrus, they had the text written inside their sarcophagus to help them reach the afterlife. It's a very sweet way, but very sad to think that this person could afford a sarcophagus, but they couldn't afford the entire package.
Burials and mummification came in several different packages, from the most simple to the most elaborate, and all this to appease the hundreds, if not thousands, of the many gods of ancient Egypt. Gods like Amun-Min with his erect penis for fertility, and the goddess Anuket, the protector of the Nile cataracts. She was worshipped all the way in the south on Elephantine Island, and later became the goddess of lust. Several other deities were worshipped at Elephantine as well, like the ram-headed god Khnum, often seen as the source of the Nile. He later became associated with the formation and creation of men. He had a temple dedicated by Thutmose III at Elephantine. Many gods had functions for the Nile, as it was their source of life, and living in the cataracts was one of the most important.
What we have over here is a beautiful, beautiful, damaged obviously, statue of the Nile god Hapi. He's here holding the lotus and papyrus, combining Upper and Lower Egypt. And he's shown in a very late 18th dynasty, early 19th dynasty, time of Seti I, Ramses I. And he is just so beautiful. He's shown with his full breasts to show the abundance of the Nile, as well as his large stomach with the folds.
Hapi is often shown combining the lotus and the papyrus, Upper and Lower Egypt. There were many forms of Hapi, such as the traditional full-bodied man, Yet he did have a feminine counterpart, and she was the goddess of the branches of the Nile Delta. Back in Berlin, I'm going to take you to meet this museum's most famous family. From the world's most overly extorted Egyptian queen to the heretic pharaoh and son of Queen Tiye.
And here he is, the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten. This bust was found at the workman's house called Thutmose. The man who created the bust of Nefertiti, he created a second version of that bust, but for the husband, for the pharaoh Akhenaten. Unfortunately, it's completely damaged, unlike the pretty much intact image that we have of Nefertiti. But this is one of the most lifelike images we will have of this pharaoh.
This strange-looking man revolutionized religion and the representation of the royal family to the public. Straying away from the idealized image that all Egyptians desired, Akhenaten went for a new, more realistic art representation. He wanted to show himself, his queen and wife Nefertiti, and his family in an overly exaggerated form of realism, showing their flaws and all. When you look into the eyes of this couple, one can only imagine, was Akhenaten a madman or a master of ancient Egyptian art and religion? This is a beautifully painted fresco from a palace at Amarna. In his new arid city of Akhenaten, this scene would bring the outside to the inside. This new style, showing movement and life rather than rigid Egyptian tones, was believed to have been taught directly from Akhenaten. Many scenes from this city show unprecedented everyday life.
A family stela from the 18th Dynasty under Amenhotep IV, later who changed his name to Akhenaten. And we see a man shown with a full beard and his son and his wife sitting enjoying the day, and he's drinking beer out of a jar, and he's drinking the beer with a straw that has a bend in it with a filter. And next to this scene we have some actual spices and ingredients that went into making this beer. It would have been a very different tasting beer to anything you guys drink. I don't drink beer, so I wouldn't know.
Beer was enjoyed by everybody in ancient Egypt, and it became a staple of their diet. Beer even became a way to pay craftsmen.
This is how ancient Egyptian sculpture was made. A big stone block, and it was drawn with lines, and from those lines they had the connecting features of whatever sculpture they were doing. So in this case we have an unfinished sphinx.
The sculptors were more free during the time of Akhenaten, straying away from the rigidness of Egypt's past. Akhenaten here holding a table for offerings. What we see over here is realism. See, these faces have been cast from real life. And who we see over here is thought to be the father of Nefertiti, Pharaoh I. It was I who would succeed Tutankhamun in becoming the next pharaoh. But of the many women of the late 18th dynasty, there is one that some believe became a pharaoh after Akhenaten. A woman who many believe died young, yet this statue suggests otherwise. Nefertiti outlived Akhenaten and became pharaoh in her own right. If we see, Nefertiti has aged. She has jowls, her breasts have sagged, even a belly, and she's hunched over. The line of succession after Akhenaten is very muddled, yet many believe Nefertiti outlived him and renamed herself as Pharaoh Nefernuaten or Smenkara. And in this courtyard, we have the sun coming through on the statues as Akhenaten and Nefertiti would have intended. Akhenaten favored the sun god Aten, and this room, bathed in the sun rays, is filled with only the images of the royals, Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and their children. What we see is a draft statue of Queen Nefertiti. We know it's a draft statue because of these lines on the bust. Similar to cosmetic surgery, they marked on this statue what they wanted to improve, but this statue shows us what she really looked like. She looks more natural. The lines on the jowls and the cheeks show us where Nefertiti wanted to be more defined. Who knows, maybe she wanted to add them in, because Nefertiti actually looked like this. Whether she wanted smoothing or defining, Nefertiti remains an icon. And I'm going to meet the ultimate image of the Queen. She was discovered on the 6th of December 1912, but investigating this statue closer in the museum leaves me indifferent with an uneasy feeling, for you see, many suggest she's not real. There is a real bust of Nefertiti that was displayed in the house of a Nazi for many years before being displayed in the museum. But that all changed in 1945. Hitler was planning his invasion of Berlin. Concerned with World War II, the Egyptians wanted Nefertiti back. He demanded that Nefertiti be taken off display from the museum and had an exact replica made of the statue. He then ordered that the replica and the original be taken to a bunker in Corinthia where they would be protected from the war. However, this led to confusion as the replica was placed in box 29 and the real in box 34. We do not know which box was brought up from the bunker, and therefore, when we look into the eye of Nefertiti, we might be looking into a fake. That bunker was never reopened. We do not know whether this is the real or the fake Nefertiti. But this leaves me with a question. Will the Germans ever return the real Nefertiti back to Egypt?
And there we have it. Those are some of the treasures from this incredible, vast museum here in Berlin, in the center of Europe. You can feel a little closer to ancient Egypt.